Hi, Rhetoric class. I'm sorry I can't be there today, but the good news is that you get video, Mr. Wahlberg, and this is almost as good as being in person on the real thing. You get to watch this more than once. Lucky you. Okay, so here's our topic for today. We're going to focus on the use of the role of the rhetor, an audience analysis, and with the tone that the rhetor would take when we analyze a piece of work, some kind of a piece of rhetoric. And so we're going to kind of move through those pieces, and always remembering that rhetoric is about convincing people of something. So you need to pay attention to what is the goal of the rhetoric. Rhetoric is not about information, although informing people is certainly part of bringing them onto your point of view. And it's not really about like entertainment, although entertainment can play an important role in convincing people of a subject. But rhetoric is always at its fundamental core about how persuasion should work. So when we consider what is the goal of rhetoric, we need to figure out what is the understated aim. And sometimes it's outright stated, and sometimes it's really implied. You think of like political rhetoric, there's an outright goal. Vote for this person, support this idea. And then sometimes there's some unstated things that there's a goal of rhetoric the goal of the rhetoric that isn't totally obvious. Or it isn't outright stated, but it's implied all the way through. So take, for instance, at St. James Academy, like I am teaching you rhetoric, and there's literally objectives that we go through each day that are intentions of meeting. But there's also an implied goal that this is a Catholic school, and I want you to know and believe the gospel and to live a life pointed towards Christ. And none of that is exactly stated in the curriculum, and it doesn't show up specifically in anything that we study, but hopefully it's in everything that we study, and that's an unstated aim of the goal. That's kind of the big picture view on rhetoric at St. James Academy, but it's also like the model is true in all kinds of rhetoric. What is the stated and unstated games? Stated and unstated goals of the work. So you want to consider what the themes are, what the rhetorician, what the rhetor turns to again and again. Sometimes we'll find that themes are very clearly laid out. There's a repeating motif that shows up into the piece. Somebody is, constantly using. I actually just saw a piece of rhetoric earlier this week that somebody was using. The theme was songs from Beyonce, and so like that was their. Like how they organize different, number one hits that Queen Bee put out. So sometimes the theme then gives you an implication into the rhetoric. I was not exactly the theme there. Maybe that's a bad example, but we'll find that there's recurring parts. But also, what is the requested action? Does the rhetor outright say, "I want you to do this. I want you to buy this thing, or to support this idea, or vote for this candidate"? Like Sometimes it's very clear. You should go live your life like this. You should pursue this goal. Sometimes it's a little more implied, so you got to figure out what is the goal there. Secondly, I want to talk about what is the role of the rhetor. In general, we would look at three types of relationship, whether it's a peer-to-peer relationship where the rhetor approaches the audience as equals. Peer-to-peer relationships are great ways of establishing like commonality. The other types are superior to inferior. And so here the idea of the role of the rhetor is that somebody knows better on a subject. They are an authority, and they're going to go and share it with them on the subject. So imagine like a military leader speaking to his or her troops. That is a superior to inferior. The troops don't make the decision on their own. That they're deferring up a hierarchy for that. Or inferior to superior. This is the classic case of speaking truth to power. Like what happens if somebody that is being, does not have a strong power relationship needs to go express something to somebody that does. This is the heart of, like, say, the civil rights movement, of saying that people are, being denied certain rights, but need to go establish it in the society at large, or to power brokers. So peer-to-peer, superior to inferior, and inferior to superior. So those are the three relationships that we might look at between a rhetor and an audience. And then the second part of establishing the role is a little more intangible, but it's that every rhetor takes a certain a role or a persona, like a character they're playing. I don't want to sound cynical about it when I say character, but there's times that a rhetor takes the position of the wise sage, or of a relatable friend. Or, I think like sometimes the job of a United States president is to be commander in chief and to say, this is the hard decision that I'm prepared to make. Sometimes the president takes on the role of like America's grandpa. And let me tell you about some things I've learned and seen over the years, things that I'd like to see for the future. Sometimes the president, takes upon the role of put upon person, like, the media is spinning what I'm saying and I'm kind of a victim here, or there's different roles that the rhetor would play, and for these I don't specifically have a list. There's not like like a categories of roles. It's a little more interpretive, and I use the example of all school mass. Sometimes the chaplain gets up there for all school mass and takes the role of spiritual father. Sometimes the chaplain gets up there and takes the role of spiritual cool uncle, wants to tell jokes and be relating. And they both have roles to play. It's both part of evangelization. It's all part of homiletics and sermonizing, that you play different roles in that. So anyway, when you consider the role of the rhetor, consider the implied relationship between rhetor and audience, but also the role that the rhetor is playing. Now, I want to talk for a second about the audience, and this is sometimes a complicated issue. We need to distinguish between what is the actual audience and what is the implied audience. So the actual audience is who is there, who is in the seats viewing what's going on and taking in the rhetoric, or what are the people listening to the music or the podcast or watching the film. So the actual audience could be like live people in the moment. It could be an anticipated set of viewers or readers or consumers, because rhetoric is many things. It is live speeches, but it's also film can be rhetoric, and newspaper articles can be rhetoric. So there's like literally the people in the crowd or the anticipated people who will consume the media. That's the most immediate, and I think that's always worth considering, who's the actual audience. But I also think it's important to consider who is the implied audience, and this is not always the same one. This is not always the same group. So sometimes the implied audience is not the people that are there. It's the people that will view it elsewhere or consume that media elsewhere. And I can think of here, like a classic example is Martin Luther King's March on Washington, when he's standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I mean, he's speaking to people that are there at a civil rights gathering, the people that are more or less on his side. But I don't actually think that was the audience he was speaking to. I think he was speaking to the people that weren't there, whether of their own volition or the people of the future that need to be told the truth. So like the implied audience is not necessarily the actual audience. And I think it's a worthy discussion as to see who is the rhetor actually trying to persuade. Sometimes rhetoric might look unsuccessful with the audience that's gathered. I mean, if rhetoric is about convincing people of something and people show up already convinced, yeah, you can say that that's successful because the audience agrees with the person. But if the act is persuasion, then sometimes the implied audience is actually who the rhetor is trying to persuade. If there is an audience mismatch, if there is a mismatch of the strategies, if the rhetor is trying to speak to one crowd in a way that is inappropriate for another crowd, there's a strong chance the rhetoric will be a failure, that the rhetor will produce a rhetorical failure. So the audience is one of those things that we sometimes think we know, but we absolutely cannot get around. The last thing I want to talk about here on our video before we hand off and do the next piece of it where we actually analyze some rhetoric is to consider what is the tone. The tone of the piece is often something you do in English classes, in literature classes. You try to figure out what the author or the speaker is trying to determine. And in rhetoric will be the same question. How does the rhetoric feel to the audience? There can be lists of tonal terms, and the author will set out with this set of tone. And they might be, sometimes the author is working as sarcastic, or a speaker is trying to be a professorial role, or the rhetoric is supposed to feel romantic or militaristic, right? There could be a list on these. I don't know that any list will ever be complete because tone is a subject of humanity, and it's a movement of what it means to be a person, and tone can change. But in general, we might say that there are reactive tones, or that there are like positive tones. There could be, caring, feelings, or quiet feelings, or lively feelings. There could be angry tones. There could be reactionary tones. There could be, confrontational tones. There's never going to be an exhaustive list, and while I'm showing one on the screen, this is not ever intended to be an example of them. The tone is always going to be somewhat subjective to the audience and how they feel about it. So when I ask you to describe the tone of a piece, I'm asking you to be subjective and see how it feels to you as an audience who might not actually be the audience in question. Anyway, that is our pieces of goals, roles, tones, and audience. It's time to go analyze some pieces of literature on that. I'm looking forward to seeing what your results are, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.